I stood by my family's swimming pool, skimming net in hand, when a black Bentley pulled into our circular driveway. Marcus Wellington stepped out, champagne flute already in hand, followed by his entourage of lawyers and investors. He spotted me by the pool and laughed, pointing in my direction. "Clean faster, girl. We want to see how crystal clear this water gets." I froze net halfway through the water as he sipped his champagne and gestured dismissively. "This house is sold, so get lost." When I tried to introduce myself as the property owner, he cut me off with a sneer. "Know your place." 6 months ago, my world collapsed when my father died suddenly from a heart attack. James Morrison had been more than just my dad. He was my mentor, my best friend, and the brilliant architect who designed and built our family estate from the ground up. The mansion sprawled across 12 acres in Westchester County, a testament to his innovative vision and 30 years of careful planning. Growing up in that house shaped everything about who I became. Dad taught me about structural engineering while we walked through the rooms, explaining how each beam and support created perfect balance. He showed me his experimental solar collection systems hidden in the roof design and the geothermal cooling network that kept our energy bills near zero. Every summer evening we would sit on the wraparound porch and he would tell me stories about sustainable architecture, about building homes that worked with nature instead of against it. But when the medical bills started arriving after his death, reality hit like a sledgehammer. The cancer treatment had drained his savings account, and somehow massive debts appeared that I never knew existed. Property taxes had mysteriously doubled overnight, and the bank was calling in loans that supposedly had years remaining. My stepmother Patricia, who Dad had married just 3 years earlier, seemed as shocked as I was by the financial crisis. Patricia pressed me constantly about selling quickly. She claimed we had no choice, that the mounting bills would force us into bankruptcy within months. Marcus Wellington's development company had made an immediate offer, she said, and we needed to accept before the situation got worse. Every conversation with her felt rushed, pressured, filled with urgency I could not quite understand. The morning Marcus arrived for his walkthrough, I had been cleaning the pool to keep busy trying to process that this might be my last week in the home where I had spent 26 years of my life. The crystal blue water reflected the colonial columns Dad had designed, and I remembered helping him measure angles when I was 12 years old, holding his surveying equipment while he calculated the perfect sightlines from every window. Marcus moved through our property like he already owned it, pointing out changes he planned to make. His assistant carried a tablet noting measurements and taking photographs of everything valuable. They talked about demo schedules and contractor bids as if I was not standing right there. When I tried to ask questions about their plans, Marcus looked at me with barely concealed contempt. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, swirling his champagne. "The paperwork is all handled. Your stepmother signed the preliminary agreements weeks ago. We close on Friday, and you need to be completely moved out by Monday morning." His assistant, a sharp-faced woman named Victoria, consulted her tablet and added, "The demolition crew is scheduled to start Tuesday. We want clean access for the heavy machinery." Demolition. The word hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean, demolition?" Marcus grinned, showing perfect white teeth that somehow looked predatory. "This location is perfect for a luxury shopping complex. Prime real estate, excellent highway access, the works. Your father built a nice house, but sentiment does not pay the bills." That evening, I called Patricia to confront her about the demolition plans. She sounded nervous, almost scared when she admitted that Marcus had mentioned redevelopment possibilities. But she insisted we had no alternatives. The debts were real, the financial pressure was crushing, and Marcus was offering enough money to cover everything with some left over for my future. Something in her voice triggered my suspicion. The next morning I drove to the county records office and requested copies of all recent filings related to our property. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The property tax reassessment that had doubled our obligations was based on a market analysis provided by Wellington Development Corporation. Marcus had influenced the valuation that created our financial crisis. But that was just the beginning. Buried in the mortgage documents was evidence that someone had convinced the bank to accelerate the loan repayment schedule, claiming Dad had missed payments that I knew he had made. The bank officer who approved the acceleration was Rebecca Thompson, and her business address matched the same building where Marcus kept his headquarters. The pattern became clear as I dug deeper. Marcus had not stumbled across our family crisis by chance. He had orchestrated it using his connections to create financial pressure that would force us to sell quickly and cheaply. This was not luck or business savvy. It was a calculated attack designed to steal our family home while we were grieving and vulnerable. I confronted Patricia that evening with printed copies of everything I had discovered. She broke down crying, admitting that Marcus had approached her just days after Dad's funeral. He had somehow known about our financial vulnerabilities before we did, offering solutions that seemed helpful at first, but gradually trapped us in deeper obligation to his company. The realization that Marcus had deliberately targeted us while we were mourning my father's death filled me with a rage I had never experienced before. This was not just business. This was predatory, calculated cruelty designed to profit from our pain. The following Tuesday, Marcus returned with his adult children in tow, treating our home like a tourist attraction. His daughter Catherine, a blonde woman in her 30s wearing designer clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, walked through our living room, pointing out antiques and artwork she wanted to claim before demolition. "Daddy, this chandelier would look amazing in my dining room," she said, photographing the crystal fixture Dad had custom designed for the space. "And these hardwood floors could be salvaged for my beach house renovation." Marcus's son Bradley wandered through Dad's study, picking up books and personal items with obvious contempt. "Most of this stuff is worthless," he announced, "but the built-in shelving could be repurposed somewhere." Marcus himself seemed to take particular pleasure in explaining his acquisition strategy to his children, speaking about our family crisis like it was an entertaining business case study. He described how he identified vulnerable properties, how his team researched family situations to find pressure points, and how they could manipulate circumstances to create motivated sellers. "The key is timing," he explained to Bradley while standing in our kitchen. "Hit them while they are emotional before they have time to think clearly or get proper legal advice. Grief makes people desperate to solve problems quickly, even when quick solutions are not in their best interests." Catherine laughed as she examined our family photographs on the mantelpiece. "I love how they always think they have some choice in the matter, as if we would offer them fair market value when we hold all the cards." Their casual cruelty was breathtaking. They discussed our personal tragedy like it was entertainment, our financial pressure like it was a game they had won. Marcus suggested that I could continue working for his company as maintenance staff for his other properties, making jokes about how I already knew how to clean pools and clearly needed the income. That evening, I began serious research into Wellington Development Corporation. What I found online made my stomach turn. Forums and review sites contained dozens of stories from families describing experiences almost identical to ours. Elderly couples losing family farms after sudden tax increases. Young families pressured into emergency sales after mysterious loan complications. Widows forced to sell deceased husbands' properties due to unexpected debts and accelerated payment schedules. The pattern was unmistakable. Marcus specialized in targeting families dealing with death, divorce, or medical crises. His company had perfected a system for identifying vulnerable situations and then manipulating circumstances to force quick, profitable sales. In every case, the families had received far below market value, while Marcus flipped the properties for massive profits or developed them into commercial projects. My research led me to David Rodriguez, a real estate attorney who had worked with my father on several commercial projects over the years. When I called to explain our situation, his reaction was immediate and angry. "Anna, I have been tracking Wellington's activities for months," he said. "Your father mentioned concerns about predatory developers targeting families in our area. He was actually consulting with me about legal protections just before he died." David agreed to meet with me the next morning. When we sat down in his office, he spread out a thick folder of documents and newspaper clippings related to Marcus's business practices. "Your father was incredibly far-sighted about this," David explained. "He had seen other families in the community get taken advantage of by unscrupulous developers. He was working on legal strategies to protect your property from exactly this kind of situation." He showed me correspondence between him and Dad, dating back almost 2 years, discussing something called a heritage protection provision that Dad wanted to include in our property deed. The letters revealed that Dad had been concerned about the increasing pressure on historic properties in our area, and he had spent considerable time researching legal mechanisms to prevent predatory takeovers. But Patricia had been hiding things from me too. David revealed that she had gambling debts far beyond what she had admitted. Marcus's company had paid off over $80,000 of her outstanding obligations to various casinos and online betting sites, creating additional leverage over our family situation. The most disturbing revelation was that Marcus had been monitoring our property for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. His company maintained detailed files on dozens of properties throughout Westchester County, tracking family situations, financial health, and potential vulnerabilities. We had been on his target list long before Dad became sick. That night, I called Patricia to confront her about the gambling debts and her secret arrangements with Marcus. She sobbed as she admitted that her financial situation was far worse than she had revealed. She owed money to dangerous people who had threatened physical harm if she did not pay. Marcus had offered to solve all her problems, but the assistance came with conditions that trapped our family into his acquisition scheme. I realized Patricia was as much a victim as I was manipulated by Marcus into betraying our family through her desperation and fear. But the damage was already done. We were scheduled to close in 3 days, and Marcus held all the legal advantages. The next morning brought a new shock. David called with urgent news. His research into Marcus's current projects had revealed that Wellington Development had already sold future development rights for our property to a major retail corporation for triple what they were paying us. Marcus was not just stealing our home, he was stealing millions in future value while paying us a fraction of what the land was truly worth. The retail corporation planned to build a luxury shopping center anchored by high-end department stores and restaurants. Marcus had used insider knowledge about upcoming zoning changes and highway improvements to identify our property as incredibly valuable for commercial development. He had manipulated us into selling for residential prices, while he profited from commercial development potential we never knew existed. Standing in Dad's study that night, surrounded by his books and architectural drawings, I felt the full weight of Marcus's betrayal. He had not just stolen our home and our financial security. He had stolen our father's legacy, our family's future, and our trust in basic human decency. But something in Dad's notes gave me hope. David was right. Dad had been preparing for this exact situation. My investigation into Marcus's connections led me deep into a web of corruption that stretched throughout our local government. I spent hours at the county courthouse reviewing public records and connecting dots between his various business entities and shell companies. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Sandra Hayes, the city councilwoman who had approved most of Marcus's recent development projects, was actually his sister-in-law. Her husband ran a construction company that received no bid contracts for all of Wellington Development's major projects. Sandra had pushed through zoning changes that specifically benefited Marcus's acquisitions while claiming to protect community interests. Even more disturbing was the revelation that 3 different city inspectors who had found violations or delays for Marcus's competitors were all part-time employees of companies owned by his business partners. The entire regulatory system had been compromised to give Wellington Development unfair advantages while crushing competition and blocking legitimate challenges to their practices. I started visiting other families who had lost property to Marcus, hoping to understand the full scope of his predatory system. The first stop was Frank Morrison, a 72-year-old Army veteran who had lost his family farm 6 months earlier. Frank lived in a small apartment complex, now his entire life compressed into 2 rooms after losing the land his family had worked for 3 generations. Marcus knew exactly which buttons to push. Frank told me, his weathered hands shaking as he showed me photographs of the farm. Right after my wife died, suddenly, the agricultural tax exemption got revoked. Property taxes jumped from $3,000 a year to $27,000. Then the well inspector found contamination that required immediate expensive remediation. Every problem had a solution, and every solution led back to selling to Wellington Development. Frank had tried to fight back, hiring lawyers and challenging the various violations and tax assessments. But Marcus's team had buried him in legal paperwork and administrative delays until the mounting costs became unbearable. The farm that had been in Frank's family since 1895 was sold to cover debts that appeared overnight. My next visit was to Jessica Chen, a single mother whose husband had died in a workplace accident the year before. Wait, I cannot use the name Chen. My next visit was to Jessica Williams, a single mother whose husband had died in a workplace accident the year before. Marcus had targeted her family home using a different strategy, claiming her deceased husband had failed to maintain proper insurance, exposing her to massive liability claims that could only be resolved through immediate sale. He made it sound like he was saving me from lawsuits that would destroy my children's future, Jessica explained, while her 2 young daughters played nearby. The insurance companies suddenly found policy violations that voided coverage. Lawyers claimed I could be personally liable for millions in damages. Marcus offered to buy the house and assume all liability, making the problems disappear. Jessica was now renting a cramped apartment and working 2 jobs to support her family, while Marcus had flipped her house to a luxury buyer for 3 times what he paid her. The liability claims that had terrified her into selling turned out to be completely fabricated, created through Marcus's network of corrupt lawyers and insurance adjusters. Each family I met had similar stories. Marcus employed teams of specialists who could manufacture financial crises, legal problems, and regulatory violations on demand. His network included bank officers who could accelerate loan terms, tax assessors who could inflate property values, inspectors who could find violations that required expensive remediation, and lawyers who could create the appearance of massive legal liability. The emotional toll of these visits was overwhelming. I saw children who had lost their bedrooms, elderly people forced from homes where they had planned to spend their final years, and families torn apart by financial stress that Marcus had deliberately created. These were not business transactions. They were systematic campaigns of psychological and financial warfare against grieving and vulnerable people. But the most shocking discovery came when I learned about Marcus's promotional strategies. His marketing team created social media content celebrating their efficient acquisitions and streamlined development processes. They filmed promotional videos and properties they had taken from families, using our pain as advertising for their services. Marcus had given interviews to business magazines where he described his targeting strategies in detail, bragging about his ability to identify and exploit family crises for profit. In one article, he specifically mentioned the advantages of approaching families immediately after funerals, before they had time to process their emotional and financial situations clearly. His company website featured case studies of successful acquisitions, including before and after photographs of properties they had demolished and redeveloped. They presented these devastating family losses as business success stories, proof of their efficiency and profitability for investors. During one particularly difficult evening of research, I found a video of Marcus speaking at a real estate investment conference. He described our situation specifically, though, without naming us, explaining how his team had identified our family as ideal targets based on Dad's medical expenses and recent death. He walked the audience through his acquisition strategy step by step, using our grief and financial pressure as an educational example. The key to this approach is speed and pressure, he told the conference audience. Hit them with multiple problems simultaneously so they feel overwhelmed and desperate for any solution. Create urgency through deadlines and threats, then position yourself as their only realistic option. Grieving families will accept much lower values if you convince them they have no alternatives. The audience laughed and applauded as Marcus described techniques for manipulating people during the worst periods of their lives. I realized that our family tragedy was entertainment for him, a source of profit and professional recognition that he shared proudly with colleagues and investors. That night, I sat in Dad's study, surrounded by evidence of Marcus's systematic cruelty, feeling completely overwhelmed by the scope of corruption I had discovered. The problems went far beyond our individual situation. Marcus had created an entire industry around exploiting vulnerable families with networks of corrupt officials and professionals who helped him manufacture crises and steal homes throughout our region. But then I remembered something Dad used to tell me when I was young and facing problems that seemed insurmountable. He would say that the bigger a corrupt system grows, the more vulnerable it becomes to collapse when someone exposes its weaknesses. Marcus's web of corruption was massive, but that also meant there were many points where pressure could be applied to bring the entire structure down. I began to realize that fighting Marcus was not just about saving our house. It was about protecting every family in our community from his predatory system. And somewhere in Dad's notes and David's legal research, I was going to find the leverage I needed to take him down. Working late into the night in Dad's study, I methodically reviewed every document David had shown me about Dad's legal preparations. The heritage protection provision kept appearing in their correspondence, but I had not fully understood its implications until I found Dad's detailed notes in his filing cabinet. The provision was brilliant in its simplicity. Dad had included language in our original property deed that required any sale to preserve the architectural innovations incorporated into the house design and to maintain proper attribution to the original creator. Any buyer would be legally obligated to recognize Dad's intellectual property rights and protect the experimental systems he had developed. More importantly, the provision included specific penalties for buyers who attempted to demolish or substantially alter the property without following proper procedures for historic preservation and environmental protection. Dad had researched federal laws governing innovative green technology and discovered that destroying certain types of experimental sustainable systems could constitute violations of environmental protection statutes. Our house was not just a family home. It was a working laboratory for sustainable architecture techniques that Dad had spent decades developing and refining. The solar collection systems, geothermal networks, and water reclamation technology represented innovations that were years ahead of their time. Federal agencies had actually provided research grants for some of Dad's work, creating additional legal protections I had never known about. As I read through Dad's technical documentation, I began to understand the true scope of what Marcus was planning to destroy. The experimental systems in our house could revolutionize sustainable construction if properly developed and applied. Dad had been collaborating with universities and environmental organizations to document and share his innovations with other architects and builders. Marcus's demolition plans would not just destroy our family home, they would eliminate research and development work that could benefit communities throughout the country. Dad had anticipated this risk and built legal safeguards into our property deed specifically to prevent predatory developers from destroying his life's work for short-term profit. But I needed more than legal clauses to fight Marcus's corruption network. I spent the next day secretly photographing evidence of his team's violations on our property. His contractors had already begun removing valuable fixtures and architectural elements before the official closing, clearly violating the preliminary purchase agreements that prohibited alterations until ownership transferred. His crew was also destroying historical documentation and research materials that Dad had maintained as part of his collaboration with environmental agencies. I photographed workers throwing away technical drawings, research notes, and correspondence with federal scientists who had been studying Dad's innovations. The most damaging evidence came when I discovered Marcus's team installing temporary structures to hide environmental violations from inspection agencies. They were covering up damage to protected wetland areas on our property and concealing the removal of mature trees that had specific preservation requirements under local ordinances. That evening brought an emotional breakthrough that changed everything. While searching through Dad's personal papers, I found a letter he had written to me before his death, sealed in an envelope marked, "For Anna, if anyone tries to take our home." The letter revealed that Dad had suspected someone might target our property after his death, based on conversations he had overheard at community planning meetings. He wrote about Marcus specifically describing concerns about his reputation and business practices that Dad had heard from other architects and developers in the region. "Anna," the letter said, "if you are reading this, it means someone is trying to take away what we built together. Remember that this house represents more than just a place to live. It represents innovation, sustainability, and hope for the future. Do not let anyone convince you that money is more important than preserving work that could help other families and communities." The letter continued with specific instructions about legal resources Dad had prepared and contacts who could help me fight back against predatory developers. He had anticipated Marcus's tactics and prepared countermeasures I was only now beginning to understand. "You have always been stronger and smarter than you realize," Dad wrote. "Trust yourself. Trust our work and never let anyone diminish what we built together. The bullies who try to take advantage of grief and pain are always weaker than they appear. Their power comes from making good people feel helpless and alone. But you are not helpless and you are not alone." Reading Dad's words filled me with determination I had not felt since his death. The grief and confusion that had paralyzed me for months began transforming into focused anger and strategic thinking. Marcus had made a fatal error by underestimating me and by targeting a family that had prepared for exactly his kind of attack. The next morning, Marcus arrived unannounced with a television crew planning to film promotional content about his successful acquisition strategies. He brought investors and business reporters to tour our property. While I was still living there treating our home like a conquered territory, he could display as proof of his efficiency and success. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity smart investors look for," he told the camera while standing in our living room. "Undervalued properties with motivated sellers who need quick solutions to complex problems. We provide a valuable service by taking difficult situations off their hands and converting unproductive assets into profitable developments." He made degrading comments about homeowners who were too sentimental to accept economic reality and described grief as a temporary emotional state that clouds practical judgment. The reporters nodded appreciatively as Marcus explained his targeting strategies and acquisition techniques. But Marcus's arrogance led to his first serious mistake. During the filmed interview, he revealed specific details about his manipulation tactics that I recorded on my phone. He described exactly how his team had accelerated our loan terms, influenced our property tax assessment, and pressured Patricia through her gambling debts. "The key is controlling information flow," he told the interviewer. "Make sure the family only hears from sources you influence, so they never get independent advice or outside perspectives. Keep them focused on their immediate financial problems so they do not have time to research the property's true value or investigate alternative solutions." Marcus had just confessed on camera to fraud, manipulation, and conspiracy, evidence that would be crucial for the legal challenges I was beginning to plan. His security team made another crucial error that evening. Thinking I had been defeated and posed no threat, they became careless about concealing their surveillance activities. I photographed them copying our mail, recording our phone conversations, and following Patricia to her support group meetings. Marcus was not just stealing our property. He was conducting comprehensive surveillance and intimidation campaigns against our family. The evidence of these activities would prove that his acquisition was not a legitimate business transaction, but a systematic campaign of harassment and coercion. That night, I sat in Dad's study with his letter in my hands, surrounded by evidence of Marcus's crimes and corruption. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt like his daughter again, determined, strategic, and completely unwilling to let bullies destroy what we had built together. Marcus thought he was facing a grieving young woman who could be easily manipulated and intimidated. What he was actually facing was an architect's daughter who had inherited her father's patience, intelligence, and absolute commitment to protecting innovations that could benefit communities for generations. The game was about to change completely. Early the next morning, I drove to downtown Albany to meet with Sarah Martinez, an environmental law attorney who specialized in cases involving destruction of innovative green technology. David Rodriguez had connected us after discovering her work with federal agencies investigating environmental crimes in real estate development. Sarah's office was filled with case files documenting developers who had violated environmental protection laws for profit. She had been tracking Marcus's activities for over a year as part of a broader investigation into corruption in sustainable development projects. "Your father's work was extraordinary," Sarah told me as she reviewed the technical documentation I had brought. "These geothermal and solar innovations are exactly the kind of experimental technology that federal law is designed to protect. Marcus has no idea what he is planning to destroy." Sarah explained that a federal task force had been building a case against Wellington Development for environmental violations at multiple project sites. They had been looking for a situation where they could prove Marcus deliberately destroyed protected technology for financial gain, and our property provided exactly that evidence. "The heritage protection provision your father included gives us multiple angles of attack," Sarah continued. "Environmental protection, intellectual property theft, historic preservation violations, and fraud. Marcus walked into a legal trap your father spent years preparing. We developed a comprehensive strategy that would use both Dad's legal preparations and federal environmental law to stop Marcus's acquisition and expose his entire corruption network." Sarah would coordinate with federal investigators while I gathered additional evidence of his criminal activities on our property. But I needed allies beyond just lawyers and federal agents. That afternoon, I called Frank Morrison and Jessica Williams to explain what I had discovered about Marcus's systematic targeting of vulnerable families. Both immediately agreed to help document his predatory practices and connect me with other victims who might be willing to join a coordinated response. Frank introduced me to an informal network of families throughout the region who had been victimized by Marcus or suspected his involvement in their property losses. The group included elderly couples, single parents, recent widows, and families dealing with medical crises. Exactly the demographics Marcus specialized in targeting. Jessica connected me with a social worker named Linda Thompson, who had been tracking suspicious property acquisitions in our area as part of her work protecting vulnerable clients. Linda had documentation of dozens of cases where families facing crises had been pressured into selling homes far below market value to companies connected to Marcus's network. "I have been trying to get law enforcement attention on this for months," Linda explained, "but individual cases looked like unfortunate coincidences. What you have discovered proves these were coordinated attacks, not random business opportunities." The network Frank and Jessica introduced me to had been gathering evidence for months, hoping someone would eventually emerge who could challenge Marcus's system effectively. They provided documentation of coercion tactics, falsified inspection reports, manufactured legal problems, and coordinated harassment campaigns that Marcus's team used against families throughout the region. Meanwhile, Marcus's overconfidence was creating additional opportunities for me to gather evidence. He had scheduled a major investor presentation for the following week, planning to live stream the demolition of our house as a marketing event for his company. His social media team was already creating promotional content, advertising the event as proof of Wellington Development's efficiency and profitability. The promotional materials revealed details about Marcus's business model that he had never disclosed publicly before. He was advertising guaranteed returns to investors based on his ability to acquire properties at 30 to 40% below market value through his specialized targeting and acquisition strategies. Marcus gave an interview to a real estate investment podcast where he described our family situation in detail, using us as a case study for his methods. He explained how his team had identified our vulnerabilities, created financial pressure through his connections, and manipulated circumstances to force a quick sale. "Grief is actually an advantage for buyers who understand how to leverage it," he told the podcast audience. "Families in crisis want someone to solve their problems quickly, and they will accept significantly lower values if you can convince them you are their only realistic option." He described Patricia's gambling debts and Dad's medical expenses as leverage points that made our family ideal targets for his acquisition strategies. The interview provided additional evidence of premeditation and conspiracy that would be crucial for the criminal charges Sarah was coordinating with federal prosecutors. But Marcus's most serious mistake was bringing potential investors to tour our property while planning to violate federal environmental laws. I secretly recorded conversations where he explicitly told investors that demolishing Dad's experimental systems would eliminate any future regulatory complications or preservation requirements. "Once we level everything and start fresh, nobody can claim this technology needs to be preserved or studied," he told a group of potential partners. "We eliminate the environmental protection complications by destroying the evidence that triggered them." Marcus had just confessed to planning deliberate destruction of federally protected technology for the specific purpose of avoiding environmental law compliance. Sarah explained that this constituted conspiracy to commit environmental crimes which carried serious federal penalties, including significant prison time. The investor tour also revealed that Marcus had been lying to his financial backers about the property's development potential and construction costs. He was inflating projected expenses to justify higher investor contributions while concealing the true profitability of the projects. Several investors were being defrauded, even as Marcus was defrauding our family. That evening, I met with David Rodriguez to coordinate our legal strategy with the evidence Sarah's team was developing. We had identified multiple criminal violations, civil fraud claims, and environmental protection issues that could be pursued simultaneously against Marcus and his network. "Your father would be amazed by what you have accomplished," David told me as we reviewed the mounting evidence. "He prepared the legal foundation, but you built the case that will bring Marcus down." The most exciting development came when Sarah introduced me to Dr. Michael Foster, a whistleblower from within Marcus's company who had been secretly documenting environmental violations and fraud for months. Michael had access to internal communications financial records and strategic planning documents that proved Marcus's criminal intent across dozens of projects. Marcus has been bragging internally about his ability to avoid environmental oversight through strategic property destruction, Michael explained. He specifically targets properties with innovative green technology because destroying the evidence eliminates regulatory complications that could limit his development options. Michael provided internal emails where Marcus discussed our property, specifically describing plans to eliminate Dad's research and destroy technical documentation to prevent future challenges to his development plans. The communications proved that Marcus understood the value and importance of Dad's work, but planned to destroy it anyway for financial gain. As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of purpose and determination I had not experienced since Dad's death. Marcus had spent months manipulating and terrorizing our family, but his arrogance and overconfidence were providing us with evidence to destroy his entire operation. The closing was scheduled for Friday morning. Marcus expected to complete his acquisition of our property and begin demolition immediately afterward. What he was actually walking into was a carefully prepared legal trap that would expose his corruption and end his predatory business practices forever. Dad had prepared the foundation, but I was going to finish what he started. Friday morning arrived with crystalline clarity. Marcus had scheduled the closing ceremony for 10 o'clock at his company's headquarters, planning to conclude with a champagne celebration and media coverage of his latest successful acquisition. He invited investors, business reporters, and city officials to witness what he described as a demonstration of his company's efficiency and profitability. I arrived early, appearing nervous and defeated to maintain the illusion that I had accepted my fate. Patricia accompanied me, genuinely anxious because she did not know about the legal preparations I had been making. Marcus's team filled the conference room. Lawyers with thick briefcases, investors in expensive suits, and journalists preparing to document his triumph. Marcus entered the room with obvious satisfaction, carrying a bottle of premium champagne and wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than most families' monthly income. He surveyed the assembled crowd with the confidence of someone who had never faced serious opposition to his plans. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "today represents another successful demonstration of Wellington Development's ability to identify opportunity and execute efficient acquisitions. This property will become a landmark shopping complex that brings jobs and economic growth to our community." He gestured toward me with condescending sympathy. "We appreciate Anna's cooperation during this transition. Losing a family home is never easy, but sometimes practical considerations must outweigh sentimental attachments." The preliminary paperwork proceeded smoothly, with Marcus's lawyers reviewing standard contract language and financial arrangements. I sat quietly, occasionally asking simple questions about moving timelines and final payment procedures. Everyone in the room assumed I was resigned to completing the sale, but when we reached the section covering property deed restrictions and architectural preservation requirements, I asked to review the heritage protection provision in detail. Marcus's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Richard Clark, dismissively explained that such clauses were routine legal language with no practical impact on development plans. "These preservation provisions are essentially meaningless," Richard told the room. "They are included to satisfy sentimental concerns, but they do not create enforceable obligations that would limit legitimate development activities." I pulled out Dad's original technical documentation and federal research grants, spreading them across the conference table. "Actually, I would like everyone to understand exactly what technologies are protected under this provision and why federal law requires their preservation." The room's atmosphere shifted as I began reading specific details about Dad's innovations and their recognition by environmental agencies. Marcus looked increasingly uncomfortable as I described the experimental system's importance for sustainable construction research and their protection under federal environmental statutes. "This is irrelevant to our transaction," Marcus interrupted impatiently. "These are old research projects with no commercial significance. Our development plans will modernize the property with current construction standards." I continued reading from Dad's correspondence with federal scientists, documenting their recognition of his work's importance and their specific recommendations for preserving and studying the technological innovations. Several investors began looking concerned as they realized the environmental complications Marcus had not disclosed to them. Then I produced the recorded conversations from Marcus's investor tour, where he explicitly discussed plans to destroy protected technology to avoid regulatory oversight. The room fell silent as Marcus's own voice filled the space, describing deliberate environmental law violations for financial gain. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said calmly, "you have just heard Mr. Wellington confess to conspiracy to commit federal environmental crimes. The technology he plans to destroy is protected under multiple federal statutes, and his stated intention to eliminate evidence constitutes deliberate criminal conduct." Marcus's face turned red as he realized the implications of what everyone had just heard. "Those recordings were made illegally and taken out of context," he protested. "Private conversations between business partners cannot be used to create false criminal allegations." I pulled out my phone and played additional recordings of his promotional interviews and podcast appearances, where he described his targeting strategies and manipulation tactics in detail. His own public statements provided comprehensive evidence of fraud, coercion, and conspiracy across dozens of property acquisitions. "These are Mr. Wellington's own public statements about his business practices," I explained to the increasingly uncomfortable crowd. "He has been advertising his criminal conduct as proof of his efficiency and success." The journalists in the room were now taking notes, frantically realizing they were witnessing the collapse of a major real estate corruption scandal rather than a routine business closing. The investors looked panicked as they understood their potential legal exposure for participating in what Marcus had just revealed to be systematic fraud. Marcus attempted to regain control by offering to double the purchase price if I would sign immediately without further delay. His desperation was obvious as he promised additional concessions and modifications to address my concerns about the heritage protection provision. "We can work out arrangements to preserve whatever you think is important," he said, sweat visible on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "There is no need to complicate this transaction with unnecessary legal technicalities." But the room's attention had shifted to the conference room doors, where federal agents were entering with search warrants and arrest warrants. Sarah Martinez followed them in carrying briefcases full of evidence that her task force had been developing for months. "Mr. Wellington," the lead agent announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit environmental crimes, fraud, money laundering, and violation of federal protection statutes. You have the right to remain silent." Marcus's investors and lawyers scrambled to distance themselves from the collapsing situation, claiming ignorance of his criminal activities and demanding immediate termination of their business relationships. The journalists documented every moment as handcuffs were placed on Marcus's wrists, and he was read his constitutional rights. Patricia stared in shock as she realized the full scope of what had been happening and how thoroughly Marcus had manipulated our entire family situation. The other attendees fled the room as quickly as possible, desperate to avoid association with what was clearly a major criminal investigation. As Marcus was led away, he looked directly at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You have no idea what you have just destroyed," he said. "My lawyers will bury you in litigation that will cost more than your house is worth." I smiled calmly and responded, "Actually, Mr. Wellington, I am not the pool girl you thought I was. I am an architect's daughter who inherited my father's patience, intelligence, and absolute commitment to protecting innovation from predatory bullies. And I just used a legal clause to cancel your multi-million-dollar deal and expose your criminal empire. Get out of my life." The room erupted in camera flashes and questions from reporters as federal agents secured evidence and began interviewing witnesses. Sarah Martinez approached me with a satisfied smile, confirming that the evidence we had gathered would be sufficient to prosecute Marcus and dismantle his entire corruption network. Marcus Wellington's predatory business empire had just collapsed in spectacular fashion, brought down by a young woman he had dismissed as powerless, and a legal provision prepared by her father to protect families from exactly his kind of attack. The next few weeks transformed our community as the full scope of Marcus's criminal network was exposed through federal investigation and media coverage. His arrest triggered a cascade of additional arrests throughout the corruption system he had built, including city officials, bank officers, tax assessors, and lawyers who had enabled his predatory practices. Sandra Hayes, the city councilwoman who had approved Marcus's projects while concealing their family relationship, was charged with bribery and conspiracy. Her husband's construction company lost all city contracts and faced federal investigation for bid rigging and tax evasion. The 3 building inspectors who had manufactured violations for Marcus's competitors were terminated and charged with fraud. Rebecca Thompson, the bank officer who had accelerated our loan terms, was arrested for conspiracy and financial manipulation. Her investigation revealed similar misconduct affecting dozens of other families throughout the region, leading to a comprehensive audit of lending practices at multiple financial institutions. Marcus's company assets were frozen pending criminal proceedings and civil litigation. The federal investigation revealed that Wellington Development had systematically defrauded investors, manipulated government officials, and violated environmental laws across hundreds of properties throughout New York and Connecticut. My father's heritage protection provision had triggered the legal avalanche that brought down an entire criminal enterprise exactly as he had intended when he prepared those safeguards years earlier. The environmental protection case became a landmark precedent for preserving innovative green technology from predatory development. The class action lawsuit that Frank Morrison, Jessica Williams, and I organized ultimately recovered over $12 million for families who had lost properties to Marcus's schemes. More importantly, the legal precedent we established provided future protection for vulnerable families facing similar predatory targeting. Our mansion became a protected historical site, preserving Dad's architectural innovations and ensuring their availability for ongoing research and education. Universities and environmental agencies established a research center on our property to study and develop Dad's sustainable construction techniques. Patricia entered a comprehensive rehabilitation program for gambling addiction, supported by counseling services that helped her understand how Marcus had exploited her vulnerabilities. She made amends for her role in endangering our family, though rebuilding trust required time and consistent commitment to her recovery. The media attention surrounding Marcus's arrest led to legislative hearings about predatory real estate practices and regulatory reforms to protect grieving families from similar exploitation. Several states passed new laws requiring disclosure of conflicts of interest and establishing cooling-off periods for property sales following family deaths. Frank Morrison became one of my closest allies in advocacy work, using his military experience and community connections to help other veterans facing property threats. His farm was eventually recovered through the civil litigation, allowing him to return to the land his family had worked for generations. Jessica Williams found stable housing and employment through connections we made during our legal battle. Her children were able to remain in their school district, and she completed nursing school with support from a scholarship fund we established for families victimized by predatory developers. Sarah Martinez invited me to join her law firm as a consultant specializing in environmental protection cases involving innovative technology. My combination of architectural knowledge and personal experience with predatory development made me uniquely qualified to help other families facing similar threats. David Rodriguez helped me navigate the complex legal and financial recovery process, ensuring that Dad's intellectual property rights were properly protected and his innovations could benefit communities throughout the country. We established a foundation to provide legal assistance for families facing predatory real estate schemes. The most meaningful outcome was transforming our mansion into a community resource where families could learn about sustainable construction, environmental protection, and legal rights. We hosted workshops for recent widows, young families, and elderly homeowners about recognizing and resisting predatory targeting. Standing in Dad's study 6 months after Marcus's arrest, I reflected on everything we had accomplished. The room was filled with thank you letters from families we had helped, research proposals from universities wanting to study Dad's innovations, and media coverage of the landmark legal precedent we had established. Marcus Wellington was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for environmental crimes, fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. His business empire was completely dismantled, with assets distributed to victims and environmental protection organizations. He would never again be able to terrorize grieving families or destroy innovative technology for profit. But the most important victory was personal. I had honored Dad's values by protecting his innovations and using his legal preparations to defend our community from systematic predatory targeting. I had transformed my grief into purpose and my anger into effective action that would protect other families for generations. The mansion was filled with laughter and hope again, hosting community events and educational programs that shared Dad's vision of sustainable construction with architects, builders, and homeowners throughout the region. Our home had become a symbol of innovation, preserved rather than a victim of predatory destruction. I realized that Dad would be proud, not just because I had saved our house, but because I had used his teachings to protect other families from the pain we had experienced. Our personal victory had become a legacy of justice and community protection that would outlast any individual success. The pool where Marcus had first humiliated me now reflected solar panels and wind sensors that students from local schools visited to learn about renewable energy. The space where he had shown his contempt for our family had been transformed into a center for education and hope. Every morning when I walked through our home, I felt Dad's presence in the sustainable systems still operating throughout the house, in the research continuing in his workshop, and in the knowledge that his innovations were being shared with communities that could benefit from his vision. Marcus had tried to steal our home, our legacy, and our future. Instead, his predatory attack had revealed legal protections Dad had prepared, exposed a criminal network that threatened our entire community, and created opportunities for our family's innovations to benefit thousands of people. Standing by the pool on a beautiful autumn morning, I understood that preserving family legacy means more than keeping physical property. It means living the values that created that legacy and using the strength those values provide to protect others facing similar challenges. Dad's greatest innovation was not any single technological advancement, but the wisdom to anticipate predatory attacks and prepare legal safeguards that would protect not just our family, but every family that faced similar threats. His heritage protection provision had become a model for legislation throughout the country. I had learned that patience, preparation, and integrity ultimately defeat corruption and cruelty, no matter how powerful and systematic that corruption appears to be. The bigger a corrupt system grows, the more vulnerable it becomes to collapse when someone exposes its fundamental weaknesses. Most importantly, I discovered that turning personal pain into community healing creates the deepest form of satisfaction and the most meaningful form of justice. Our family's crisis had become an opportunity to protect countless other families from similar predatory targeting. The mansion where I had grown up was still my home, but it had also become something larger. A symbol of resistance to predatory behavior, a center for innovation and education, and proof that prepared families with strong values can defeat even sophisticated criminal enterprises. Marcus Wellington learned too late that he was not facing a helpless victim, but an architect's daughter who had inherited the tools and determination necessary to protect innovation from predatory destruction. He had picked the wrong family at the wrong time in the wrong way. Have you or someone you know ever faced predatory targeting during a family crisis? How do you think communities can better protect vulnerable families from systematic manipulation and fraud? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your insights could help others recognize and resist similar schemes. Thank you for following Anna's journey from vulnerability to victory. If this story inspired you to think about protecting your family's legacy and standing up to predatory behavior, please like this video, subscribe for more stories about justice and resilience, and share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding how legal preparation and community support can defeat even sophisticated corruption. Together, we can ensure that innovation and integrity triumph over greed and manipulation, creating stronger communities for everyone.